Welcome to First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, the birthplace of congregational humanism. We carry on that tradition of free thought today, dedicated to promoting a free search for truth, meaning, and justice. Our web address is firstunitarian.org. Thank you for joining us.
These are unsettled and unsettling times, said absolutely no generation of Americans before us ever. Well, maybe they did, but perhaps these times seem particularly unsettled because they're happening now and they're happening to us. Someday, hopefully, they'll pass. But in the meantime, there is a sense of comfort and relief that can be derived from recognizing that there are certain cycles that will play out regardless of the political storms that are now everyday occurrences. Some things are just greater than any of us, and connecting with them in a direct way can help anchor us in times of uncertainty. It being August, well, you know exactly what I'm referring to. Now, maybe this isn't exactly the force greater than ourselves that you were expecting me to talk about. But this is Minnesota, it is August, and therefore there is only one thing that is truly important, and that is, of course, the Minnesota State Fair. How many people are planning to go to the State Fair? Show of hands. Look, oh my goodness, just almost everybody. Fantastic. I see a couple of folks who didn't raise their hands, but it's always wonderful to have tourists welcome to FUS this morning. Now, maybe this chart, this slide illustrates a little bit more the cycle you thought I might be referring to. Don't we have to study it? I won't be using it as a lecture, but this chart represents the cycle of the seasons. And here at FUS, many of us believe that connecting with the cycle of the seasons is an important element of our spirituality. It does remind us of our connection to something greater than all of us, greater even than the State Fair, if this can be believed. Of course, the most visible celebrations that we hold are those surrounding the equinoxes and the solstices. But we also recognize a few other occasions throughout the course of the year. These are referred to as the cross-quarter days, the halfway points between the equinoxes and the solstices. For about the past 10 or 15 years or so, we have recognized the halfway point between summer solstice and the fall equinox. This is an event that goes by a number of different names. The one that we use, and that is fairly common, is what's called Lammas. If you're looking at this, it's in the lower left corner of the slide. And the word Lammas is understood to be a sort of a contraction or a corruption of the words loaf mass. This was the time of year in much of the world that heralded the very beginning of the harvest season. In Europe, where many of our ancestors came from, it was still early yet, but some crops, particularly wheat, began to be ready for harvest. And so at this time of the year, people would be harvesting wheat and processing it and baking it into loaves of bread. And this community event of people coming together in these ways was referred to as a loaf mass, or in our words, Lammas. At FUS, our celebration has tended to continue this focus on grains, bread, and baking. And as Lisa mentioned earlier, you can smell it, and it is so good. You'll hear more about it later. Perhaps the history of people getting together at this time of year around themes of harvest helped inform the scheduling of the Minnesota State Fair. According to Catherine and Linda Kautsky in their book, Minnesota State Fair, An Illustrated History, it all began in 1852 when the territorial governor, Alexander Ramsey, created the first agricultural society in what was then the territory of Minnesota. 2 years later, the society held its first territorial fair. And the intent behind this event was at least twofold. First, it would serve as a forum of sorts for farmers from across the state to come together to share knowledge of how to increase crop yields, which strains would be the most productive, and what kinds of machinery and other supplies would help them to be the most successful farmers possible. It's a rather manly sounding event, as perhaps this photo of fairground grain inspectors reflects. But the other big purpose of the territorial and then the later state fair was to serve as something of an advertisement for Minnesota. It's hard to imagine just how isolated Minnesota would have felt to people in other parts of the country. This was kind of the edge of the known world. I feel much the same way whenever I'm west of Highway 100. Organizers of the territorial fair were trying to promote this part of the country as a place where people could come, a place where they could have a future, where they could belong. In a sense, this was Minnesota's welcome mat, inviting people to come in, to sample what Minnesota had to offer. These events must have been reasonably successful because only 4 short years later, Minnesota had enough of a population to be able to successfully petition Congress to admit Minnesota to the Union as a state. That was 1858. In 1859, the territorial fair became the state fair. From its very inception, wheat was an important crop representing Minnesota in the nation and at that state fair. But a bunch of wheat, that's fantastic, but it only tells part of the story. What do you do with it? Well, of course, the thing you do with wheat is typically you turn it into flour and bake with it, just as people had been doing at Lammas for generations. But as I said earlier, the fair was all about farming and crops and machinery and so forth. And this was a fairly masculine event. And baking did not fit into that ethos. So the organizers recognized that to expand the offerings of the fair to show what you could actually do with the wheat involved making sure that women attended the fair. Some of the promotional materials from the 1863 State Fair, for example, which took place at Fort Snelling, were specifically designed to attract women to participate and to bring their arts and crafts, including their baking, to the fairgrounds. And it really was quite successful in that women did take part, and it became just that much more of a community celebration. Being what the Times would have considered women's work, the baking aspect of the state fair was assigned to, for lack of a better phrase, the ladies' auxiliary. The fact that I refer to the ladies' auxiliary while the editor of the Minnesota Women's Press is in the audience confirms I like to live dangerously. Now, the so-called ladies' auxiliary went by a number of different names, but it did not have its own building within the state fair for decades. Perhaps so-called women's work simply wasn't valued that much. According to Carol Marling, author of Blue Ribbon, a social and pictorial history of the Minnesota State Fair, quote, "Men could do almost anything, but the ladies were conceded supremacy only in the realm of jellies, bread, quilts, and Battenberg lace." These exhibits sort of moseyed around the fairgrounds from year to year, but there was no fixed home until the early part of the 20th century, when a new machinery hall was built and the old one was turned over to the ladies to be the women's building. And this is where you would find the baking, the arts and crafts, the quilting, and so on, probably some Battenberg lace as well. The strong association of baking with so-called women's work was perhaps illustrated best by an incident that took place in the early 1900s, according to the Kowskis. They write, "In the early 1900s, a daring man entered the women's world of baking competition. He arrived at the fair with a large collection of cakes and registered a tutti frutti cake along with the other delicacies. The ladies didn't think it was a fair contest, but he went home with a couple of second-place ribbons." Now, I, of course, hate to traffic in vicious stereotypes. unless the universe hands them to me. But when I read of a man in that era bringing a tutti frutti cake to the state fair, I feel like I have found both a forebear and a role model. According to Minnesota State Fair, the history and heritage of 100 years, it wasn't until 1952 that these aspects of the fair got the gender-neutral name home activities. Interestingly enough, according to Marling, in 1905, at the entrance to the women's building sat a 300-pound loaf of bread, said to be the biggest ever baked in Minnesota. Marling reports that little by little, as the fair went on, it was nibbled away by hungry visitors. Reflecting on the story, Marling thinks, even in its pristine state, the loaf was an ambiguous presence. On the one hand, it stood for the basic task of the housewife. But the huge loaf of 1905 was also a harbinger of modernism. Prepared by a commercial bakery, it signaled a major change in the old-fashioned role of women, whose most arduous chores were being lightened and even eliminated by machinery. In that vein, Marling notes that by the 1930s, when this photo was taken, the Betty Crocker folks were offering baking classes at the state fair because, increasingly, young women were not learning the art of baking at home. Certainly, baking competitions became a highly popular part of the state fair. Marling quotes an early 20th century report as follows. People seem crazy to buy the premium cakes and pies, and they're willing to pay a good price for them. One woman begged me for just a taste of the lemon pie so she could see if it was better than she could make, reported one dignitary of the baking division. Marling notes that despite the pleas of hungry visitors, however, the goodies were not for sale. Instead, they were quietly donated to residents of charitable institutions once the fair closed. The wisdom of that policy was reportedly demonstrated in 1915, after the director of one such agency thought it might be more lucrative to auction off slices of angel food and lemon meringue at a booth near the grandstand and keep the proceeds. He thereby touched off what the newspapers described as a near riot among gluttonous fairgoers scrambling for a crumb of a genuine prize-winning confection. I know that you are just as shocked as I am to hear state fairgoers described as gluttonous. Now, this happy crew was part of the baking competition in 1922. Perhaps one of these women was Dorothy Clow of Humboldt, Minnesota, who wowed the crowd that year when she addressed her audience through the persona of her own cake, as one obviously would. After describing the baking process, including the surely legendary line, "After egg whites are added to the cake, my mistress puts me in the oven. When I am baked properly, I become a beautiful golden brown," Clow reportedly added, and I hasten to say, this is a quote, "I have a very dear friend, the sponge cake. Once in a while we quarrel, but not very often. Sometimes she becomes angry with me if I seem to be more popular than she is. However, she soon quiets down and we're friends once more. On the whole, I have a very enjoyable life and would not be anything else for the world." One imagines that the summer of 1922 may have been a little hotter than normal, and that it might have gotten to Ms. Clow. But you know how it is after a long day at the state fair. Any of us might find ourselves channeling the odd baked good conversationally. Baking was used at times to help promote other products as well. According to Marling, Haralson apples were introduced in 1932, but she says the response was tepid. The variety didn't really catch on until 1936, when the Minnesota Fruit Growers Association centered its exhibit on a golden brown, 100-pound apple pie made with 2 bushels of Haraldsons. I wish there were a photo of this. The size, the aroma, and the flaky grandeur of the pastry launched the long-keeping Haraldson on its career as Minnesota's favorite apple pie. At my eventual memorial service, please be certain that someone describes me as also having had flaky grandeur. Of course, baked goods remain a central part of the Minnesota State Fair experience. The Star Tribune recently reported that in 2025, nearly 3,000 people entered baking competitions at the fair across 82 categories. And the competition evolves. NPR recently reported that the State Fair will now offer the Marjorie Johnson Honey Bee Award, named after an iconic Robbinsdale resident who won over 2,500 ribbons at state and county fairs, earning her the title of Blue Ribbon Baker. She passed away in October at 106. Patty, you've got some work to do. Today, baked goods at the State Fair take on new forms, perhaps not specifically contemplated in the fairs of previous generations. For example, I'm already, right? And of course, we certainly can't forget. Right, okay, everyone, yeah. For me, it's not the State Fair until I've had my hot pretzel. What is it for you? What's your State Fair go-to? Wow. Well, that was an unplanned moment. Whew. In 2004, American author Jesse Browner wrote, "Eating and hospitality in general is a communion, and any meal worth attending by yourself is improved by the multiples of those with whom, I see, it is shared." If true, well, here it is. You know, I could just stop here, right? It's just, right, you know, what else is new, right? I'm going to read that quote again, because then it makes the picture look a little bit more. Anyway, in 2004, American author Jesse Browner wrote, "Eating and hospitality in general is a communion, and any meal worth attending by yourself is improved by the multiples of those with whom it is shared." If so, then given the crowds, eating at the State Fair may rank among the highest spiritual acts possible. Remembering this will help you justify another visit to the Dairy Barn, I promise. On a rather smaller scale here at FUS, baking and serving bread, like the baking that occurred at the earliest territorial fairs and for generations at Lammas time, is part of our way of inviting people in, of showing hospitality. Henri Nouwen, in Reaching Out, the 3 movements of the spiritual life, writes that hospitality means primarily the creation of free space where the stranger can enter and become a friend instead of an enemy. Hospitality is not to change people, but to offer them space where change can take place. That second sentence in particular reminds me of how we tend to view UU communities like our own, and I'll read it again. It is not to change people, but to offer them space where change can take place. Perhaps, as wise people once suggested, as part of a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And thinking specifically of eating together, in her book, More Than Merely Eyes Can See, author Susan Carey writes that sharing a meal is a social experience. It creates the kind of intimacy where who you sit next to is as important as what is served. Eating together opens up space for conversation and for sharing information. Sitting down together slows the pace of living. It puts a pause in the day. It lets you catch your breath. Typically, each week, our dedicated crew of kitchen volunteers, led by Bill McGue, offers us the invitation to come together, to break bread, to get to know one another, and to see how we can belong, reminding us of spiritual author Joan Chittister's observation that hospitality is not simply a matter of opening the door, it is a matter of opening the heart. Today, the folks downstairs are joined by the mighty baking team, from whom we will hear shortly. The late Queen Elizabeth was remembered for reciting in Australia an Aboriginal proverb which reminds us that we are all visitors to this time, to this place. We are just passing through. Our purpose here is to observe, to learn, to grow, to love, and then we return home. To extend welcome and hospitality to one another is one way to express the love that sits at the heart of our UU values, one of which, interdependence, we heard of earlier. Those folks who organized the original territorial fairs knew the same thing. Invite people in. Let them see what the place has to offer. Say, here, join us for something to eat, and let's get to know one another. You may find you belong here too. Joining us downstairs for a meal after this program is not just about connecting with one another and building beloved community. Sharing bread at this time of the year reminds us of our connection to that cycle of the seasons we care about here, and to our place in the cosmos, whose movements drive that cycle. UU Minister Sherry Prudhomme, reflecting on both the Transcendentalists and the UU value of interdependence, noted, one 19th century Universalist and Unitarian minister on the Pacific coast went so far as to preach that we humans had been invited as guests into the community of all life. I think Lammas is an invitation to come together, to celebrate, to connect with the timeless rhythms of nature and with one another, and to remember that we are all capable of extending and accepting the great gifts of welcome and hospitality. Bread is the season's vehicle for accomplishing this, as its central role in Lammas celebrations over the years suggests. The aroma, even just the presence of bread, can symbolize for us a sense that we are home and that we are someplace where we can belong.
Thanks for listening. You can find much more about humanism and what's happening at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis by visiting our website at firstunitarian.org.